questions or wants to talk about any of the things that I introduced, please feel free to reach out to me afterwards. I'm happy to have a word with you. So we're going to look at the sector from three the lens from three different perspectives. First global, then the region, ASEAN or Southeast Asia, and then we'll make some comments about Vietnam in general. EdTech, it's an odd sector. I'll be honest, a lot of people can't even agree on the name of the sector. I was just having a conversation with a gentleman this morning, and he was calling it EdTech, and I was calling it EdTech. And so, compared to a lot of other sectors like FinTech and Health Tech, where it's very clear what it is that you're doing and what your business proposition is, etc., EdTech tends to be a little bit more broad and encompassing. The sector as a whole, I would say, at the moment we're at about the fifth wave of progress within the sector. We can go all the way back to, computer-assisted learning. So let's first look at the money coming into the sector. All sectors need money to fuel innovation and new ideas and new companies. The sector as a whole has traditionally been undercapitalized. So if we compare it to healthcare or health tech, actually health tech, this is one aspect of healthcare. If we looked at healthcare in general, it would be significantly larger. But we've got this education sector as a whole that's traditionally just been this chasm. And so that's been more or less the investors coming into the space, because they're saying, well, look, digitization has yet to kind of fully embrace to the scale that it should be within this sector. So we're still, kind of in this phase. If we look at venture capital, I won't talk about public markets or private equity too much or at all, but if we look at venture capital, which is the money coming in to kind of fuel the innovation within the sector, this is how EdTech's looked over the last 10 years. Obviously, 2020 to 2022 were kind of these peak COVID years where there was a lot of money coming into the sector. Prior to that, 2017, 18, 19, a lot of that was China-driven, as we know. And so what's normal, or what we're expecting, is probably somewhere in here. So I think in the years to come, given the AI, popularity of AI and that infusion into the sector, ideally will be somewhere around this range. So compared to a lot of other sectors, there's a reason for that. A lot of the money going into EdTech tends to be early stage and not so much growth stage, whereas if you look at venture capital and other sectors, health tech, fintech, clean tech, etc., there's a lot more money going into the growth stage. And that has its own consequences and whatnot. So one thing I'll mention about the sector as a whole, other than just a few financial comments, are on a global level, we're seeing a lot of digitization and optimization within higher education systems. Specifically, platforms and programs. So for example, if we look at OPMs, or online program management providers, this represents partnerships. This is the amount from 2021, the amount that we're expecting to 2025. This is based, we're already halfway through 2024, so we kind of know about the amount. And so OPMs are basically, if you're not familiar with OPMs, it's when a university doesn't have the capacity to essentially manage their own online programming, and that can include anything from admissions to marketing, basically to content generation, to managing the actual courses themselves. So the university tends to maybe lend its brand, lend some of its expertise, its academic professionals, etc., and then together they share in the revenue. And so this has been a very profitable initiative over the last few years. The problem is it tends to skew very favorably towards the OPM. Some of the commissions for the OPMs can be as high as like 50%. And so you can have like a top tier university, like an Ivy League university that wants presence in some part of the world, Southeast Asia or Central Asia or something, and the university lends its brand, and then an OPM goes ahead and manages all their engagement. So we're kind of seeing an evolution. Maybe the finance is starting, or the benefits of the OPM partnership are starting to shift back more towards the university and less for the OPM. So we'll see what that has to do. But there's a lot of providers and players in this space, and so this is one area that's kind of new and changing. The other one is EdTech bootcamp. So there's a lot of universities that do not have the capacity to offer, let's say, industry or highly specific industry content and courses. So they'll bring in a private provider to come in and kind of offset that void. And so we call it boot camps. It's not like a hackathon or something like that. It's an actual program in this regard that comes in and builds, again, the capacity around a very niche specific area. One of them could be the need for people to manage data centers, right? So Vietnam has a lot of new data centers that are in the process of being built, and so there's a skill set around the management of that that needs to be accommodated here in this country. So it's likely that FPT or whoever is managing a lot of the training for that will have a bootcamp provider come in and offset. So we're seeing a huge uptick in the amount of higher education bootcamp providers. This tells us a lot of things. It's, do universities need to evolve just in general to basically, should they be outsourcing this? At what point do they have better industry academic connection? Okay, can you, did I do that, or can you make that a little smaller so it fits on the screen? Just so we can see. Yeah, there you go, thank you. Another thing that, actually this is probably the most predominant area in higher education optimization, is the growth of student mobility pathways. And there's a lot of reasons for this to change over the last few years. Here in Vietnam, you might be familiar with Apply Board. They have a very strong presence here. Leverage EDU, which is, I believe they're new to Vietnam, but you'll be seeing a lot more of them. Leap Scholar. Leverage and Leap are both Indian student mobility platforms. IDP, and obviously they're not public. IDP is a public company. They own IELTS and things like that as well, but they're the strong public provider that's dominant in this space. So basically what happened in China used to have the largest migration of students every year for overseas study. It was roughly, in any given year, there was close to 1 million Chinese students studying in Europe or Australia, the United States. And then with the pandemic, and then with the geopolitical kind of environment, a lot of that has shifted to India. And so India, these Indian players have basically just come up very quickly in the last 2 or 3 years, and they're quite large, they're unicorns. And so we're seeing a lot of services around what they offer. So they offer finance, visas, employment, language, not just admissions, but these are in addition to admission services that they offer. The other thing that's quite important here is traditionally, when you went to study abroad, you were limited, or you had limitations into where you could get your financing. That's totally gone now. There is a significant amount of options for people that want to finance their studies overseas. Some of these providers do that, some of them are partnered. So it's a very interesting space in terms of student mobility for overseas higher education study. We can see, again, the number of providers, whether they're directly helping these or they're competing with these, has gone up significantly in the last 4 years. Another area, and these are all higher education disruptions. So this is what we're seeing globally that's kind of changing the industry. Another area in disruption is business, just business studies, business schools. We're seeing a change very quickly in alternatives to traditional MBA or traditional business coursework. that's very much expert-led. You might recognize this gentleman, Scott Galloway, very famous podcaster and TV show host, etc. So he has his own, basically, MBA program. Seth Godin. There's a bunch of people that are prominent business people that have just went ahead and started their own graduate business. Jack Ma has one in China. The Chinese government told, it used to be called Jack Ma University, but the government told them to change the name, so it's called something else now. But in any case, we're seeing a lot of these UpGrad, which is having an increasing presence here in Vietnam. I'm sure you're familiar with Minerva, etc. But these business schools are typically cheaper, quicker, more targeted. They're usually kind of in a hybrid or blended kind of mode. The amount of popularity is just very quickly going up. So this is an area to watch, especially for this part of the world. There's groups for the most highly valued EdTech company in the world right now, which is Emeritus out of India, has a lot of programming in this space as well, a lot of partners. Okay. All right, so another area that's not higher education, or a trend that we're seeing globally, is the rise of OMO. And I believe Class N is one of the leaders in this space. But there's, it's important to kind of zoom back and see, well, where did the need for OMO eventually come from? And so there's this continuum of tech-enhanced learning, basically, that we've been writing for the past 8 or 9 years or so. And so there is, differences between very basic as it's hybrid, and then blended, which was a more kind of strategic use of online modalities. Online merge offline, which is kind of the next iteration of this, is more focused on a seamless interaction with the experience, so the teacher's kind of toggling back and forth seamlessly. And so that's kind of the focus now. So we see a lot of universities, a lot of schools, or governments that can afford it, they're kind of moving into this space. So after the pandemic, we had this phase of kind of risk mitigation. We should have an online offering in the event we have another pandemic, in the event something happens, we can maintain continuity with our studies. But online merge offline currently is kind of like the top tier level of that. That said, given its emphasis on seamlessness, I'm just wondering what the next phase will be. And I think it might have something to do with going beyond the classroom and just having a seamless learning experience at your leisure 24/7. So this is, especially with AI, especially with the ability to have AI chatbot tutors, maybe we'll have AI fellow students as opposed to doing Genie Book, which is a Singapore company with some presence here in Vietnam. Pretty much all the Vietnam providers, Marathon and Everest and all these that do K-12 tutoring, they're also kind of trying to straddle this. And there's reasons for that. Partly it's lower customer acquisition costs, lower CAC, and there's models that kind of have proven this over time. So we're seeing a big uptick in OMO. Let's see, go back to the... Yeah, can we have the slide just a little bit up, just so we can see the bottom part of the, maybe pull this down if you could. There we go, perfect, thank you. So I think if we look at all this, these platforms and these partnerships, just like in normal businesses, as markets mature, they get more niche specific. And that's kind of what we're seeing. And so we're seeing a lot more specificity with SaaS as a service, platforms as a service, university partnerships. They're getting very, very more specific. So this is in the case of LMS or even CRM. We're all familiar with Salesforce. But what we're starting to see is a lot of things that are targeted specifically to the education sector, through EdTech. So there's CRM platforms that are specific to EdTech providers. Obviously, LMS is part of education, but we're starting to see, even within the realm of LMS, your Moodles, your Blackboards, your Desire to Learn, etc., they're all having competitors come up, non-incumbents that are very niche-specific and are starting to take market share. So it's a very interesting time in higher education. Essentially, all that specificity improves outcomes and hopefully the experience. All right, two last slides just about the global perspective before we talk about Southeast Asia. China and India, which are obviously on equidistant sides of Southeast Asia. China, prior to the pandemic, was essentially, as we all know, kind of the world leader in EdTech in terms of not just companies, but in a lot of the technology, innovation, etc. came out of there. So now, after their policy clampdown from a couple of years ago, we're starting to see a lot of the companies that survived the clampdown take Southeast Asia a lot more seriously. Prior to the pandemic, there were companies from China coming in, but it was more to show like a growth narrative. Some of them were here in Vietnam or were here in Southeast Asia, but not with too strong a presence. That's starting to change. We're starting to see Powfish and Spark and a few others really look into the region aggressively and literally hire hundreds and hundreds of people. So these are well-resourced, well-funded, very knowledgeable teams that had EdTech at scale in China prior to the pandemic or even during, but more or less the policy clampdown, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's been a couple of years now, basically shut down the K-12 core subject online industry in China. So more people, more Chinese groups coming in, and starting to see it as a sincere regional market. Okay. There's another, yeah. And then India. So in China's absence during the policy clampdown, India basically filled that void. And so a lot of the most valuable tech companies in the world are based in India. A little asterisk there is Byju's. I just say Byju's situation because if you've been following the industry closely, there's a lot of issues associated with that. It's once the most highly valued edtech company in the world. Now they've had to give back or raise money just to kind of maintain, and there's a lot of concern about this. If the company goes down, will it bring the sector as a whole down with it to some extent? That said, there's a lot of good things happening in India that I think are having a positive impact on the sector, not just regionally, but globally. India, for a long time in Asia in general, there was a lack of proper data policy, frameworks, etc., regulation around the use of tech, especially for cross-border issues. So you had AWS coming in, not really helping too much in that regard, as much as they were like in the States or in Europe. In Europe, you have GDPR. In the US, you have organizations like FERPA, which basically regulate, especially for children, like when you're managing educational data for someone under 18 years old, there's certain things you have to adhere to in order to maintain the integrity of the data, etc. That's been absent in Asia in general. And so we're just now getting to the point where there's very good policy kind of around that space, especially with a lot of it's been forced by AI. And so India just recently updated their internet policy in general for the whole country for the first time in 20 years. And so there were a lot of details in that upgrade and update to do with education. So Singapore and India are essentially kind of leading the way in that space, and I think some of that will filter down into at the country level elsewhere. So that's a very good thing. The other thing that's quite interesting about India is they've opened up for the first time to higher ed foreign institutions that can come in and build brick and mortar. As you know, Vietnam has stopped all licensing. So anyone that wants to build or establish a new university in Vietnam, you can't do it unless you buy some existing entity already. So there's a big market for that. Okay, so Southeast Asia, how are we doing on time? Okay, all right. Southeast Asia, I'm just going to point out a few trends. I'm not going to read all of this. There will be an abridged version of this deck for those that are interested that I'll share with the class and team, and you can download. It won't be in as much detail, but so don't worry about that. But these are just some of the kind of high-level observations and trends that we're seeing across the sector. I think most notably is, again, I said I wasn't going to talk about AI, but I will mention the LLMs. And so what we're seeing is a need for localized or national level LLMs in regards to education, like as opposed to tapping into a lot of that data from the US or from markets outside. So the companies that are best suited to do that are all Chinese at the moment. And so there's a huge market for Chinese providers coming in to help countries like Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, etc., to set up and establish their own localized LLMs, which then education systems can be based on too. So that's a big thing right now, and we'll see how that plays out in the next few years. There's a lot of business opportunities around that as well at the moment. Early years, K-12 regional trends. Obviously, there's a lot of growth in the region. Urban growth is far outpacing rural growth. We're seeing consolidation or aggregation of a lot of rural schools, especially here in Vietnam, etc. Mid-market, affordable private schools. So not at top tier, but mid-market. So there's a lot of, all of the largest private school groups in the world, the top 5 or 6, your Nord Anglias, your GEMS, your Cognitas, etc., that manage large school groups, all of them are either going public or raising $1 billion or more right now for global expansion. And some of that is based here in this part of the world, in Southeast Asia specifically, but that's a regional trend as well. What we're also seeing for STEM and coding, which I think is relevant to Vietnam, here you have Mindex and Techie and a few other players. Up to now, it's been coding and STEM that have been the interest in parents, but I think now we're at a point, thank you, where there's an awareness of things beyond coding. So things that build critical thinking skills, are no longer novel, they're necessary. And so we're seeing a lot of companies come up with that. There's a company called Curio that has expanded globally very quick. They're present here in Vietnam as well. I'm going to quickly go through a few more slides just so I can get through a lot of that. All right, so from an external perspective, for people that look at Vietnam and want to engage this country, engage Southeast Asia first, we try to tell them not to look at it in totality. Obviously, we all live here, so we know this. We know these numbers. We know the face. But if you're looking to partner with anybody from outside, like a foreign company, etc., this is kind of the framework we recommend. It's just kind of like a 3-tiered way of looking at Southeast Asia. And so essentially, when you're talking EdTech in Southeast Asia, it's 3 countries. It's usually Vietnam, Indonesia, and Singapore. And so I'm just going to roll through a couple slides. This is there's data and information behind this. We didn't just randomly put up stars and pies and not, but just for simplicity, this is how we look at a lot of the sub-segments of the EdTech market here in Southeast Asia. So for example, if we look at online English language learning early years to K-12, which is quite dominant here, a lot of providers here in Vietnam. We look at things like market consolidation, the competitive landscape, localization difficulty, and this is interesting, Chinese efforts, because as I was alluding to before, a lot of these Chinese players, they have the capacity to come in and build out something very quickly and aggressively. So it's always important to take note. And then, propensity to pay or your pricing opportunities. So as we can see here, Singapore is the least consolidated market. Vietnam has the most competitive landscape. And I think English language, or ELT, especially for early years in K-12, will always be highly fragmented here just because of pricing and whatnot. Offline tutoring core subjects. Singapore, the most competitive, obviously. Why? Because you can drive anywhere and drive across the whole country in 45 minutes. So there's not a big need for online services when you can physically be anywhere quickly. Vietnam, Indonesia, about the same. We're skipping over a couple. Okay. Now let's a couple quick words on Vietnam. This is interesting. I think one of the, Vietnam is very proud of its PISA results. Everybody knows the PISA results and knows it's the anomaly, on the chart and how well you do in math, science, etc. World Bank, they outsourced to The Economist. So not World Bank, excuse me, Asian Development Bank outsourced to The Economist to establish this, I believe it's called DERF, Digital Education Readiness Framework, which gives you an indication how well a country is doing on adopting and utilizing education technologies. So I think this is, PISA is great for learning, but this is on a different level, I think just as valuable. And I think what's really interesting here, and first of all, they only did around 10 countries initially, but if you have a look at where Vietnam is, well, first of all, here's the level of development, least developed to highest developed, and then you look at the indicators. Blue is kind of an overall policy, governance, students, parents, or the benefits of EdTech to them, infrastructure, schools, teachers, etc. But if you look at Vietnam, what's interesting about Vietnam, and to some extent Indonesia, although I think Vietnam does better, is the consistency amongst all the different variables. And so I think that's great. And so if you look at an exemplary example of which countries are doing best in this part of the world, I think Vietnam is clearly, pull out Singapore. It's easy to manage a country if you only have 5 million people. Doing it for 100 million people is a lot harder. So I think Vietnam is definitely, leading the way in that regard. This is not a fully this is just notable. I put notable. We have everybody's logo and name and whatnot, but these are some of the more notable companies in the K-12 online space here in Vietnam. And so some of the things that we're witnessing in Vietnam, as I mentioned before, is like race for OMO. So you had a lot of companies with minimal kind of online, offline capabilities and capacities, but they're quickly building that out. And so that's quite interesting. The other one is just center economics. So there's still a huge opportunity for tier 2, tier 3 cities to have a presence there. And what's happened, and the reason this has changed in the last couple of years, is because of the kind of rise middle class, you can charge similar pricing to maybe what you get in an urban environment. So the profitability is still quite good. All right, I'm going to show one or two last slides and quickly go through. I'll have to skip through these. Just to sum up, so what we do, again, we're a boutique management consulting firm. We also run something called EdTech Asia, which is a big summit every year that focuses on impact, innovation, and business and education. ClassN has been contributing to that for years. So we're in Singapore this year, October 4th and 5th. If any of this kind of stuff interests you, we're a good place to do that. Most of the work we do is not front-facing, because our clients are corporates, conglomerates, governments, funds, foundations, etc. Some of the work we do is front-facing. So these are all publications that you can see on the internet that either I myself have wrote or contributed to, or people within my company. This is a great one, scaling access and impact. If you're more on the impact side of the continuum, that was from about 4 or 5 years ago. The next one is a World Bank report that I helped write about a year ago, using EdTech to improve student learning in East Asia, etc. And so some of these, this will be in this deck. The link will be in the deck that I shared at the class meeting, if any of that interests you. And then last, thank you for your time. I hope you learned something. Here's my email if anyone wants to take a picture and reach out. Happy to discuss this in more detail. So thank you so much, and that's it.